Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, parasites. Good, bad, necessary? Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Adrianna Chabot. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Adrianna, take it away.
Hi guys, I'm Adrianna. I'm going to be presenting about parasites, maybe a topic most of you don't want to learn about, but there's some bad things, there's some good, and then at the end you guys get to decide if it's necessary. So as we go forward into this, we'll just go over an overview of everything and then I'll introduce myself further. So digging right in, what are parasites and why should we care? We're going to go over the general life cycle, how they're able to do what they do within the body, the bad, the good, and the necessary. So a little bit about myself. I grew up in Southern California in San Diego County. I grew up with a deep love for getting to be outside and a love for nature and animals. So much so that my parents for a long time were encouraging me to be a veterinarian. Though in high school, I ended up taking a veterinary science course, and in that we learned about parasites, and it was there that I was like, absolutely not, I want no part of this world. Funny enough, I am actually a veterinary technician for half the year while living in Salt Lake City. The other half of the year, I am a guide with NatHab. This is my first season with them, and this is my first webinar, so I'm very excited to get to share and broadcast all of this information with you. I also work in the backcountry of Yellowstone where I do backpacking trips. And so I just get a really well-rounded view of the ecosystem itself. I went to school up in Northern California at Humboldt State University. It's there that I got a degree in zoology as well as a minor in Native American Studies. And I just really fell in love with nature so much more, being encompassed in the redwoods and seeing the ferns and getting to see these massive banana slugs. I lived in California in various regions for a very long time and then moved up to Washington, eventually Oregon. I've lived in Minnesota for a short stint, and now I am living in Salt Lake City where I hope to stay for a while. I got the idea for this presentation because when you're a guide in Yellowstone, you have to watch a video, and that video talks about the flora and the fauna and different ecological factors. And one of the things that it talked about was toxoplasmosis in the wolf population. And we're going to go over that quite a bit in detail later, but it really sparked an interest in me. The other thing that piqued my curiosity in parasites was while in school, one of my evolutionary professors mentioned that there may be a link with parasites being in our GI system and how without them we're actually lacking some stuff. And again, we're going to talk about that a little bit more lately, but that has lived in my mind rent-free ever since. So as we move forward, the definition of parasite is defined by one organism that is taking from another without giving back. So there's a lot of different organisms that can be considered parasites, and it's important to have some awareness of them due to their high prevalence within our own environments and within our world. So here we have a large variety. We have fleas, which many of you know of if you have pets at home. Toxoplasmosis follows that image, and again, we're going to go over that a bit more later. You also have gulls, which are genetic modifications to a plant that protect an insect. You have the Helminthes family. You have cuckoo birds, which if you're not familiar, a cuckoo bird will parasitize a different bird's nest. So you have an infant on the right of that image, and the mother will go and lay her eggs in a different species. So here we have a fairy wren raising a cuckoo bird baby, and so that baby will be raised by that different species. The next one we have is cordyceps or zombie fungi, and then I also included Indian paintbrush. Indian paintbrush or prairie fire is just one of my all-time favorite plants. The reason for that is because it's a little bit sinister. It is considered a hemiparasitic plant, hemi just meaning partially. So it's partially parasitizing a plant within that ecosystem. It still has green, which tells you that it's still producing that chlorophyll. However, it's attached to the root system of another plant, probably a grass species, and is taking some of the nutrients from that grass species. Moving forward, we have different life cycles for hosts. So not every parasite follows this kind of life cycle, but the ones that we'll be talking about today predominantly do. So parasites require a host to complete their life cycle. A parasite will sometimes go through an intermediate host, just meaning, and it's not the main host that the parasite can complete its life cycle in. And we'll talk about that more when we get to toxoplasmosis, where mice are the intermediate host. They do need to eventually get to their definitive host or their primary host before they're able to go back into the environment and reproduce. This is a constant arms race with parasites and hosts, where parasites are avoiding detection by secreting immune modulating factors. So they're able to dampen their presence, almost like when Harry Potter puts on his invisible cloak and sneaks throughout Hogwarts. Parasites are doing a very similar thing. They're sending out hormones in order to get the body to not recognize them as an invader in the body. So on our left, we have a wasp. A wasp is laying its eggs within a caterpillar. That caterpillar will continue to live on up until that larva hatches. The larva will then eat the caterpillar, turn back into a wasp, and that life cycle will continue. Our example on the right is Giardia. If you have ever had Giardia, which unfortunately I have in a very mild but unpleasant way, I was just like not able to eat for almost a week straight. So you get Giardia typically from food or water. In my case, I probably got it from the dirt being contaminated. So you end up ingesting that, it gets into your system, it'll reproduce within your gastrointestinal system, and from there you or the host species will excrete into the environment, and that parasite can continue that life cycle once again. So we're going to start off really simple with the very clear bad. So these examples that I have here are a mosquito, a flea, and then a tick, and these are considered ectoparasites. They are all sucking blood in different ways. They have different proboscises or mouth parts that allow them to suck your blood. They also have different bioactive components in their saliva that stops the body from being able to recognize that a bite has taken place. So we've all probably had it where we get bitten by a mosquito. We don't notice it at the time, but we all get a welt later. Unless you're really lucky and you do not, then you're one of the rare anomalies. But you do very much see that response from your body after that bioactive component of their saliva has left. The other thing that I would be amiss in not talking about as a veterinary technician for half the year is that even your parasites can carry parasites. So here we have that a mosquito is biting probably a dog, and that mosquito is releasing heartworm into the body. So the heartworm parasite will get into the vascular tissue and slowly make its way up into the heart. Once it gets to the heart, it's able to breed and reproduce and shed their larva back through the vascular tissue, where a mosquito will come by, bite a dog, and then again taking in that parasite and go and transmit it to somebody else. If a large enough load is contained within the heart, it can actually rupture an animal's heart. If you do want more information, I do encourage you to go talk to your local veterinarian, but I will leave that there for now. We are going to move on to galls. So galls are really interesting structures that are not well researched enough. So galls happen when an insect injects their eggs into a plant tissue. And when they're doing this, they're also injecting gall-forming factors. And that ends up changing the DNA of the plant and makes it create weird structures that it probably wouldn't have at any other time. So it's basically hijacking the cellular makeup of the plant. It's completely changing the DNA. So we have a picture to the right, which is a juniper gall. And this is a weirdly near and dear gall to my heart because in my time being outside, I came across this gall by myself, and I wasn't familiar with what this was at the time. So I knew that galls are a conifer, and thus they create cones, and this structure that we're seeing here very much looks like a conifer cone. But I also was aware that junipers create a waxy blue berry, which is actually a type of cone, and it's just disguised as a berry so that birds will come and consume it and then excrete it somewhere else in the environment and working as dispersal. So I see this gall, or I see this cone that's formed on this juniper, and I can't help but be curious, and I take a lot of pictures, and I ended up having to contact a researcher that studied junipers, and he informed me that this was a gall and that it was likely caused by a midge fly. They can also be caused by wasps or other insects. And I've also seen them in junipers, like almost a fleshy pink flower. It's just really fascinating, the different type of evolutionary structures that these insects can do. Now, as I move forward with this topic, here's a really beautiful cross-section of an oak apple gall. So they've taken that formation, they've cross-sectioned it, and in the middle you can see the larva that's forming. And as that larva hatches out, it's going to consume all of that fibrous tissue on the inside before kind of escaping throughout that hole. Now I want to talk about how it's important for a parasite to get into the correct host. If a parasite is sending out gall-forming factors or sending out immune modulators, it has to be recepted by the correct species. If they're not doing it correctly, then they're not going to be able to have this correct process form. So oftentimes what you're seeing in parasites is that they are very host specific and they're trying to end up in a very specific host. So this wasp here is probably only able to parasitize a oak species. Another really interesting parasite that we have is called our zombie fungus, our cordyceps. If you watch the show The Last of Us, then you have probably been introduced to this parasite or this fungus before. I've personally not watched it, but my understanding of it is that this cordyceps has adapted to higher levels of body temperature and thus is able to reproduce in humans, which does kind of make a lot of sense to me, but hopefully if that ever happens, I'm not around to see it. So you have this parasite, and what it has to do is get into that primary host. Again, it's really important that it's getting into the correct insect species because it is, again, releasing hormones and doing other things. So the spore becomes present in the environment, circulating through the air column. It'll eventually circle around and land on a insect, and in that portion of time, it'll make its way into the body cavity of the insect. Once it does that, it's going to slowly eat the non-vital organs of that insect. Again, this is really important for it to get into the correct host. If it doesn't, then it's not able to know what is vital and what is not vital. While it's slowly making its way and eating the host, it's trying to prolong its lifespan in order to direct the host on where to go. So it's sending out these hormone signals. What the cordyceps is trying to get done is for this insect to go up high in the forest canopy, high up in the environment in which it's located. So if you've ever seen BBC, they did this really beautiful documentary on this where there's this ant that is infected with a cordyceps. The ant makes its way up to the highest tree in the canopy, and it is at that point that the ant latches on with its mandibles onto that branch and starts to decay. It's a fast time-lapse video, and the insect starts to decay, and as it decays, this mushroom, this fruiting body of this fungus, begins to emerge out of it. So really interesting. So we've seen how ectoparasites use bioactive components to stop your body from noticing. We've seen the genetic hijacking of galls and plants, and now we're seeing how parasites can even change how the brain is working. And that's going to lead me into our toxoplasmosis. So in order to talk about this in any abundance, I first need to talk to you about the Yellowstone ecosystem. And as I mentioned before, wolves are going to be an important part of that and in the ecology. So taking some steps back, let's talk about what happened to wolves in 1926. In 1926, wolves were completely eradicated from the Yellowstone ecosystem. There is none left. And now you have this environment that is used to this keystone species, and that species is no longer prevalent. You start to have elk and ungulate species, ungulate just meaning hooved animals like elk, deer, bison, all that stuff, starting to have a different personality trait. They're no longer afraid of being out in the open. Some of you may have seen the short YouTube clip of wolves are changing the rivers and they're changing the ecosystems. And to some extent they were. When they got reintroduced in 1995 to 1999, they did help change the ecology of Yellowstone. However, there are some species that are not mentioned in that documentary that are very pertinent. One of them is beavers, which are the architect of the wilderness, but the other one is mountain lions. So mountain lions were also extirpated from the environment, completely removed. And they are also a main hunting species that is critically important to the ecology of this environment. So you have this plummet of both wolf and mountain lion species, and we reintroduced wolves. However, we didn't reintroduce mountain lions. They naturally started to come in the 1980s, which gave them a little bit of a heads up on the wolf population. However, their populations are still trying to regrow to the amount that they once were. So this is going to be really interesting to see how these two predatory populations start to overlap in their dynamics, and it's going to become a really important role that they both play. But we're first going to leave our feline in the wilderness and go to a cat that's a little bit closer to home. So if you have ever been pregnant or had a pregnant person around you, then you may have heard of Toxoplasmosis gondii. So Toxoplasma gondii is received by cats if they are eating wildlife. Though if you have an indoor-only feline, this is much less likely to occur. So your cat will ingest a mouse that is infected with Toxoplasmosis gondii, and that mouse is acting as an intermediate host. So it's going around foraging in the environment. It's going to ingest something that has that parasite. That parasite's then going to make its way into the mouse's gastrointestinal system, making its way into the muscle, and then eventually making its way into the brain. It is at this point that that parasite will start to change the behavior of the mouse. And what it does is make the mouse less fearful and more risk-taking. So it'll actually not be scared of a cat at all, and thus the cat will consume it and the life cycle will continue. So when we look at our felines that are out in the wilderness, they too are carrying this toxoplasmosis. And as you have an increase in wolf populations, you're starting to have an overlap in these two populations. So here is just a little map, and it basically shows in these cross-hatched lines that this is the mountain lion population, and then there's three different packs. On our left, we have a pack that is not largely interacting with that mountain lion territory nearly at all. The red wolves are an indicator of the infection rate of toxoplasmosis. So on our left, there's nearly no wolves in that pack that are infected, whereas on our far right, we have a much higher rate of infection. There was some research that was done in elk to see if maybe elk were acting as that intermediate host species. However, there's very few to no results of elk carrying this parasite. And with the strong correlation of wolves and mountain lions, it's pretty understood that toxoplasmosis is being spread through mountain lion and wolf interactions. So there was an article published in 2022 that collected data on 229 wolves over the course of 26 years. What researchers were looking for, it was toxoplasmosis and how it was affecting wolf populations. We have done research previously in lions and hyenas, and also researching toxoplasmosis that is occurring within those populations as well. So we wanted to see if there was some overlap in our wolf populations in Yellowstone. What they first did was they took the blood samples of wolves from 1995 to 1999. It was there that they got to look at 50 individuals and see if they were positive for toxoplasmosis. All 50 were negative. Now, in 2000, they found 3 wolves that ended up testing positive. This is the first ever documented case where these wolves in Yellowstone are testing positive for toxoplasmosis. 1 in 8 wolves every year after tested positive for toxoplasmosis. They also were testing mountain lions within this same time span. 62 cougars were tested. 52 were positive. This is just showing that the overlap of these 2 species is very important in the spread of this parasite. And when I say that wolves are getting this parasite from mountain lions, I should say that it doesn't necessarily need to be carnivore on carnivore action or predator on predator action. They may not always be fighting. It could be that a wolf is scouting out the environment, ends up consuming some of the fecal matter or infected dirt, and that's how they're also getting it. So why is it important? Why do we care if toxoplasmosis is getting into the wolf population? How does that change our understanding of wolf dynamics? So as I mentioned before, when we're looking at the mice, it is changing the mouse's behavior to be less fearful, more risk-taking. And that is because when that parasite is getting into the gastrointestinal system, making its way into the muscles, and then eventually into the brain, it is increasing the amount of testosterone and dopamine being released by the body. So the parasite is in the brain, and it's increasing these 2 hormones in order to cause the animal or the host to be less fearful. And that is advantageous when it's in the mouse because it allows the mouse to be eaten more likely. From here, what we're going to start looking at is we're going to look at how this comes into play when we look at wolves that are dispersing. And we're going to look at what that means when a wolf is a pack leader or an alpha and how that changes pack dynamics. So dispersal just means when a wolf leaves the pack in which they were born into and goes out in seeking either a new pack or is going to establish their own pack. So research found that dispersing wolves were 11 times more likely to be infected. This is really interesting. Dispersal is very costly. It can lead to a high mortality rate. And so what that can mean is that if a wolf goes out and leaves its pack, it has less access to food. It may come in confrontation with other wolves that will in turn kill it. And there's just no support system. There's a much greater risk of mortality. The other thing that's really interesting from this research, it showed that wolves that dispersed that had toxoplasmosis were also more likely to be successful. This is also really important because if you're successful in dispersing, you're more likely to be able to reproduce. So animals that are dispersing are increasing their reproductive success within this environment. And they either can form new packs and create more genetic dispersal, or they're establishing a pack in unoccupied territory, which is also really fascinating. Another thing that's super interesting is that wolves that were infected were 46 times more likely to become a pack leader than those not infected. Again, this is really costly. This can cause a higher rate of mortality, or it can also mean that they are more likely to have reproductive success. A pack leader is the one that is usually the primary producer in creating pups in the pack. And so you're seeing this really interesting thing where this parasite is actually increasing the reproductive fitness of these animals, which is fascinating. This is the first time we're starting to see that parasites are almost a positive aspect within this. So what else? This is not only interesting that it's increasing reproductive success, but it's also interesting in understanding how it's changing pack dynamics. So a less risk-averse pack leader is more likely to change the mentality of the pack to be similarly. That means you have an entire pack that is less fearful. This can mean chasing away grizzly bears that are coming and trying to steal your prey from you. This can also mean going after more difficult game. So within the last 10 years, research is showing that every pack within the park is now hunting bison. This was not true previously, and it may in part be due to this less of a fear response. So bison and other ungulate species, or all of these prey, can be very harmful. One of the main reasons that wolves are dying in Yellowstone or being killed in Yellowstone is actually from prey mortality, where if you're getting kicked by an elk, you are going to die from internal bleeding. If you're getting gored by a bison, you are also more likely to die. So this is just really cool how it's changing the entire pack dynamic, and kind of can lead to a multitude of areas. They did also in this research see if it meant there was more human encounters or you have more habituated wolves. This research largely proved that that was not the case, and that wolves were not trying to interact with people more, and that it was primarily just changing their prey and their territory and their pack dynamics. This is also really interesting because if you have a pack that is less fearful, you may actually have more encounters with mountain lions. So in this case, wolves are that intermediate species. The parasite still wants to get to that feline species, that mountain lion, in order to complete its complete life cycle. And so if you are less fearful, you may actually go towards a mountain lion and want to get rid of it, because mountain lions and wolves can have intersecting pathways of going after the same game. If a wolf goes after a mountain lion and dies, then you have a higher chance of, as a parasite, getting back into that mountain lion. So thus far, we've learned that parasites are negative. So you may be wondering, well, why is it not negative here? As I mentioned earlier, if toxoplasmosis gets into you as a human, it can cause issues. If you're a pregnant female, it can cause deformities as well as a loss of that pregnancy. An acute load of parasites within a wolf can also lead to infant fatality and cause litter loss. This risk-taking behavior, as I mentioned, increases the chance of mortality. That means that these wolves may not be living quite as long, and that can also cause some issues with the longevity of your line. So basically what I'm trying to say is there's evolutionary boundaries in place in order for that parasite load not to become so abundant that it's killing off multiple different species. Though, as I mentioned before, this is the first time that we're seeing a good side to parasites to some extent. Evolution is all about reproductive success and getting to disperse those genes. So it's really interesting to get to see that happening here. I do want to say that if you ever get to go on a trip with Nat Habit to our Yellowstone branches, that you also get the chance to hopefully talk to wolf biologist Taylor. And she's been in the park for several years now. She's got some of the highest wolf watching hours. She is so amazing. And I talked to her briefly about toxoplasmosis, and I asked her about it. And she told me every single pack leader within the park has tested positive for toxoplasmosis, which is really interesting. There has been a little bit of research of toxoplasmosis in people that are not pregnant. It has shown that sometimes these people that are infected with toxoplasmosis can have a very entrepreneurial spirit. You're no longer fearful of taking those risks and going out and starting your own business. Or you can get schizophrenia. So, really luck of the draw there. So maybe don't go and eat your cat's litter. It's my only advice there. As we're moving forward, we need to, and moving towards more of a human aspect, we need to talk about the helminthes family. So helminth just is Greek for worm. It's a group of organisms that have a similar form but are not evolutionarily related. It's more of an umbrella term to describe this 4 different phyla that we're seeing here. So you have the annelids, which are your ringed worms or segmented worms, and this includes your leeches and your earthworms. You also have platyhelminthes, which is your tapeworms and flukes. I'm a little partial to the platyhelminthes family. In part, if you look at that worm in the C category, it has little eye spots. So this is when we see the first development of eyes. The other thing that's really cool about this group is that they have really amazing regenerative properties. If you split them in half, if you split them in quarters, they are able to create full organisms out of those different attachments. And so they're just really interesting. They're quite fascinating. We've been studying them for a very long time on their regenerative properties. The other family that you have is your nematodes, which are your whipworms, heartworms, and pinworms. They're going to be the primary group that we're focusing on. And then you also have your acanthocephala, which are your thorny-headed worms. So in order to dig deeper into this, we also need to talk about hygiene hypothesis and what that means. So the hygiene hypothesis says that an increase in sterility, or just having more purified water where we're not being in contact with bacteria, viruses, and parasites, and those not being a significant part of our environment, is strongly correlated with an increase in both autoimmune and allergic diseases. So today, helminthes only affect about a quarter of the population when it was previously universal. Everybody had them. They've been in our fossil record for 240 million years. So that just shows that as long as we have existed, these parasites have existed with us. This hygiene hypothesis was first noted in 1958, though it resurfaced in 1988, when it was noted that roughly 1 in 8 children in industrialized countries, just meaning again that you have clean water, you have access to medical care, or disinfecting more things. 1 in 5 children in industrialized areas were suffering from allergic diseases such as asthma, allergic rhinitis, which is just fancy for allergies, and atopic dermatitis. This trend has only increased within the last 10 years. Asthma is more than 15% likely in developed countries, and then atopic dermatitis affects 15 to 30% of children worldwide. There was one research study that was done that took mice that were predisposed to be diabetic. And what they did was they separated these mice out into 3 different categories. So you had this population of mice that's predisposed to be diabetic, and you're putting some of them in an extremely sterile environment where contact with bacteria or parasites is much less likely. You have a third group that is being mildly exposed to parasites and bacteria, and then you have a third group that is even being inoculated with parasites and bacteria. Research showed that the mice that were in a completely sterile environment developed type 1 diabetes. The mice that were not, that had some exposure or were even inoculated to parasites and bacteria, were less likely to develop type 1 diabetes or completely protected. This same process is very similarly seen in people where individuals in low and middle income areas have a higher potential of having intestinal parasites. They are also seen in having fewer cases of inflammatory bowel disease, fewer cases of asthma, and are less likely to be immunocompromised. So we're seeing this correlation where parasites are actually causing less inflammatory issues. They're actually helping to get rid of those inflammatory issues. So part of the thing that's happening is that when you're infected with helminthes, so we have a nematode here on our left, when you're infected with helminthes, your TREGs or T cell response comes into play. So your T cells assist in stopping excessive immunological response and helping to maintain immune homeostasis. You can think of it like sort of the Benadryl of your body. It's going to tamper down and making sure that your body is not overly producing and attacking itself. When infected, your T cells help to protect from excessive inflammation. However, this may also reduce the protective immunity, which allows for a chronic infection to establish itself. So basically, your T cells are saying, hey, slow your roll. We don't want to over-attack ourselves. And thus, that's allowing this helminthe, or this nematode in this case, to establish itself chronically and continuously reproduce. The helminthes, once it gets into your body, will even stimulate and develop the T cell or that Tregs to moderate the immune system response. So it is aware that it has adapted to intentionally cause this T cell response so that it can develop itself chronically within your system. There are some thoughts that when a parasite begins to get into your system and its burden load, or the amount in your body is too great, it'll actually reduce its own chronic infection to promote its own survival. So it's not doing it for you. None of this is for you. It is simply trying to exist in your body without detection. And if you die, it is not beneficial. One of the ways that I like to think of this is that if a if a kangaroo was going about its time in Australia and all of a sudden there's a dingo after it, it's going to start running. What a kangaroo can do is have a joey that's in development within the utero. It can have a joey that's about the size of a grain of rice and it's on a nipple starting to grow. It can also have almost a fully formed baby that is able to exist in the environment and move about very freely. So you can have just a normal joey, a normal baby. So if a kangaroo is being chased through this environment and this dingo is starting to catch up on her, she's going to take that fully formed baby, she's going to throw it at the dingo, and that is in hopes that the dingo will stop chasing her. And unfortunately, she is sacrificing her baby in order to allow for these two other babies to continue to live and for her to continue to reproduce. Again, the idea that reproductive success is very important in evolution. So that's basically what these nematodes are doing, is they're stopping their production in order to allow the survival of their host species. The host in turn will actually attune its immune system, so those T cells will come out to play and it'll start to dampen itself very quickly in order to avoid any collateral damage. You can basically think of these parasites as some very unlikely friends, kind of like we have for this cheetah and this dog. The host and the parasites have co-evolved together. So once we have removed this parasite from the equation, our immune systems are increasing, they're overshooting, and it's harming our own body. There's not a whole lot of research that has been done on people. In one very small experiment, they took a group of patients that were celiac patients, and they infected them with hookworms. The results showed that those that had been infected by the parasite were actually more gluten tolerant, so they could consume more gluten. Now, as I mentioned, not a lot of human trials have been done quite yet. The biggest case size that I found during this research was about 40 individuals, which is quite small. And there was going to be one that had about 200 patients, which would have been really fascinating. However, due to the placebo having some really odd effects, they had to discontinue the experiment with hopes of coming back to it later. So more studies need to be done on human trials, though, as you can imagine, not many people want to be infected with a parasite. Even after all of this, I don't know if I'm quite interested in going out and getting my own little parasitic friend. There are some studies that are looking into seeing if we can't synthetically develop that immunological response and using that for immune therapies worldwide. But basically, further research is still going to be needed. I don't encourage you to go out and eat dirt in order to get your own anti-inflammatory parasitic friend. There are some novel parasites such as Giardia, which is not fun to have. Take it from me. I didn't enjoy it. I did not vomit and have diarrhea, or as I like to call it, DHD or double-headed dragon. But the inability to eat for a week and move my body a whole lot was pretty bummer, especially when you're in my field where that's kind of all you do. The benefits of parasites are not intended. These parasites, like I said, are simply trying to have their own reproductive success and complete their own life cycle. And any sort of bonuses are not intended for your well-being or your health. And so, yeah, but you guys get to decide if you think that maybe parasites are a necessary part of our bodies. This is just a really brief overview of some of the sources that I cited from. And other than that, thanks guys for listening. And Rob, if you have any questions for me, I'm open to taking them.
All right. Thank you so much, Adrianna. All right. So before we dive into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, you can submit them via the question field in your control panel. If you go to the upper right-hand corner, you see those 3 lines. Go ahead and click on those. That'll open up a menu. Go down to questions, and that's where you can reach us. All right. So let's dive into some questions here. So, do infected wolves pass on parasites to other wolves in their pack? Does that happen easily?
Yeah, so that's a super good question. And I do remember reading about it. I don't remember if it's passed on from like mother to offspring, either through embryonic fluids or milk. But if an animal is defecating in the environment, then yes, that if they're by any means consuming that infected dirt or that fecal matter, which corophagia or eating poop is not unheard of in the canid field. So it would be quite possible. The research article I read didn't dive into that by any degree, but yeah, it would be expected that that is happening.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for that. So is toxic plasmosis lethal to wolves or cougars by causing heart issues? Is it similar to domestic dogs?
So toxoplasmosis is not like heartworm disease where it's getting into the heart system by any means. What it can do is, as I mentioned, it can cause fetal fatality or litter loss. And that is pretty extensively harmful to a pack in and of itself. Though, and if you have too high of a burden load, yes, it can kill the individual. Any parasitic infection is drawing nutrients away from you, and so thus you're not getting your full amount of nutrients if you're eating a kill. But it's not harming it in the same way that it would for, say, heartworm disease. But yeah, it can. It's just not creating such a high burden load in most individuals, even mountain lions, as far as I know, where that's happening to any large extent. You have to think about the evolutionary factors. Again, if that host is dying, you are also dying. You can no longer reproduce, and it's just your offspring that'll be reproducing. So that's something to consider as well.
Does it affect the behavior of male and female wolves similarly?
Yeah, that's a super good question. It does affect it similarly. However, male wolves have a stronger likelihood in dispersing and a stronger likelihood of becoming that pack leader when infected. So it is showing a slight between males and females infected and not infected. It's showing just in general that those that are infected are more likely to disperse and become pack leaders. However, between the two genders, male wolves are more highly affected than females are.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for that. So in the areas where these wolves or mountain lions are infected, can they infect ungulates if they are lucky enough to get away?
Um, yes, technically they can. However, as I mentioned briefly, there was look at elk species because a large concentration of our wolves and our mountain lions are existing in the northern range of Yellowstone. This is also a huge migratory pathway of Yellowstone in itself. In fact, like I got to do this backpacking trip in Hell Roaring, where I have just never seen so many bones or antlers in my entire life. And part of that is because it's a huge migration pathway, also because it has a large concentration of carnivores in that area. But the idea is that if an elk or an ungulate is coming through, it's eating that infected grass, infected soil, whatever it may be, that they would get that parasite. The research isn't showing that that's happening. As I mentioned before, they looked at the elk species to see if the elk was acting as that intermediate host, sort of like that mouse is. So your intuition is correct. The research is just not showing that at this time.
Gotcha. Thank you. So a lot of questions about what other animals that toxoplasmosis affects. Bears and beavers, for instance,
Yeah,
are they
the
susceptible?
ones. I have to think about that for a second. Mostly because the research article doesn't talk about it to any extent. I would assume that you have the potential, especially in bears, especially since, again, that there's that overlap in environments. Though one thing that I think is important in keeping in mind in this is that wolves and mountain lions are enemies. If they come in contact with each other, they will fight. And part of or it's expected that they will fight. I'm not either a biologist in either of these things extensively. I just have a great interest in them. So one of the reasons that would happen is because they're going after very similar prey. If you have a large mountain lion population and you're a wolf pack, you're probably not getting as much food because this mountain lion population is eating a lot of it, potentially. And the cycle can go either way. So I would almost think that like coyotes and foxes, I would think the other felid species within Yellowstone would also have it. So that bobcat, and lynx. But to answer your question bluntly, I'm not 100% sure. I would think that it would make sense, but it is not the research that I'm aware of.
Gotcha. Thank you. So what about humans? How does toxoplasmosis affect us? If
Yeah.
I am scooping kitty litter, for instance, if I wash my hands thoroughly, will I be okay?
Yeah. Basically, this has to get ingested, right? So, Giardia. I got Giardia because I was living outside. I touched dirt. I ate my food, and that Giardia was on my hands, and thus it was in my body, which is just a real big bummer. But if you are scooping your cat's kitty litter and you're like, gosh, I really don't want this parasite, just wash your hands, and you'll be great. Do the happy birthday song like they told us to do in COVID and childhood. The research isn't super extensive on people that are not pregnant. So when you're pregnant, as I'm sure a lot of people are aware, you're more at risk for a lot of things. And so it has a larger chance of causing the loss of a pregnancy or causing some deformities within that pregnancy. I don't know extensively. I'm not as interested in people medicine as I am in animal medicine. But the other thing that I saw was that it could potentially cause you to be an entrepreneurial, or you could be really aggro and aggressive and have some schizophrenia. There's also other factors that come into that, such as your own genetic makeup, your own family history, your own life experiences that are also going to come into play there.
And can you get toxoplasmosis from breathing, like breathing in cat litter, dirt, for instance, anything like that?
Maybe. I think that would be pretty hard to research. Obviously, like, no, actually, I wouldn't think so, mostly because that parasite would end up in your lung tissue instead of in your gastrointestinal system, which is where it wants to go. If it gets in your lung tissue, there could be some other altercations there, but it would die. It wouldn't live. So I talked about heartworm disease really briefly, and I mentioned that it's a primary factor in dogs. And that's because if you get bit by a mosquito that carries heartworm disease and you're a human, your blood temperature just simply isn't high enough. Dogs can be up to 100 degrees and 102 degrees and be pretty okay. And so that's why we medicate them for it. and not people, because the parasites simply cannot live within our systems. So just like toxoplasmosis could not live within our lung tissue and reproduce successfully.
So, do you think parasite cleanses are a good thing to do as a general rule?
I think you should talk to your doctor. I am not a doctor. I just found this interesting. I thought that this was really interesting and fascinating. Personally, I'm not going to go eat dirt. As I mentioned before, nematodes are primarily in this dirt substance. And so I don't think parasites are nearly as bad as we make them out to be. I certainly don't use antibacterial hand soap with my everyday occurrence. I don't spray down my counters with bleach every day. Bacteria and parasites are naturally a part of our environment, and your body does have systems in place to fight against that. Now, does that mean you get severely ill sometimes? Absolutely. I'm taking a risk, right? Like, I'm accepting that there's some bacteria in my life that I don't know what they are, but they're going to be there, and I'm going to embrace them, I guess. But I'm not a doctor. I think that if you want that answer, you should probably go talk to your medical professional.
I think that's fabulous advice. Well, unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us today.
I'm not a professional in this topic. I just thought it was really interesting and was going to dive into it on my own time, and thought I would share with you, since there are so many negative connotations with parasites. I just want to challenge that idea that bacteria and viruses and parasites, these things that are kind of pounded into us, are this horrible thing. And they're not great, right? They're pretty icky. Parasites are still pretty gross. But I just want to challenge the idea that these things are horrible for us. They're a natural part of our environment. They're something that we've been around our entire existence. And so maybe we just don't need to be quite as fearful of them as the world tends to make them out to be. But thanks, guys, for listening. I enjoyed giving my first daily dose with y'all.
Adrianna, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.